The first time Elias Mercer saw Clara Whitcomb run, she was still wearing the blue dress meant for her wedding. The church bell was ringing noon across Dry Creek. Coal hissed in the forge. A wagon rattled over the hard-packed street. Elias stood at his anvil with a half-finished silver ring in his hand when she flashed past his open window like a piece of sky torn loose and blown the wrong way. Not walking, running. Her skirt was muddy to the hem. One glove was gone. She looked over her shoulder once with the rigid, quiet fear of somebody who knew panic only made cruel men faster. Then she disappeared behind the feed store. Elias set the ring down. Before we go any further, settle in wherever you are tonight. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always like knowing who's keeping company out there while the fire burns low. Then he crossed the street. Behind the feed store, the air smelled of oats, mule sweat, and pine boards cooked by the sun. Clara stood with one hand pressed to the wall, as if she needed proof the world still held solid things. In the other, she gripped a folded letter so tightly the paper had gone soft. When she saw him, she straightened at once and tried to gather herself into dignity. "Miss Whitcomb," he said. "I'm sorry," she answered too quickly. "I didn't mean to make a scene." "You haven't yet." A strained breath left her. "That feels like a technical kindness." He nodded toward the paper. "From Pike." All the forced steadiness in her shoulders loosened. "Yes." He held out his hand. She hesitated, then gave him the letter. The handwriting was broad and handsome in the way a snake can be handsome if you forget what it is. Gideon Pike wrote that he expected her at the church within 10 minutes. He wrote that her late father's debt remained valid. He wrote that if she humiliated him publicly, he would collect every dollar by stripping apart her aunt's boarding house and selling the lumber piece by piece. At the bottom, he had added one final line. "A woman without protection should be grateful when a decent man offers terms." Elias read it twice. The second reading only made it filthier. "Does your aunt know?" he asked. "She knows enough to be frightened," Clara said. "She thinks if I go through with it, he may leave the house standing. And if you don't, then he ruins her because of me. And if you do?" That answer took longer. "Then he ruins only me." Forge smoke drifted into the alley. Elias had lived in Dry Creek 9 years, long enough for people to trust his hands and long enough for nobody to mention his wife unless they were new and careless. Mara had drowned east of Pueblo 7 years before, when the river looked shallow enough and proved it was not. He still woke some nights with cold in his chest and her hand slipping from his. He looked at Clara and saw a different kind of drowning. "Are you going back?" he asked. Her chin lifted. "I was trying to decide whether duty and surrender are just different names people use when they want a woman to walk quietly into harm." That struck him harder than the letter. He said, "Give me 10 minutes." "For what?" "To do what I should have done the first time that man mistook fear for permission." She stared at him. "Mr. Mercer, you don't know what he's capable of." "No," he said softly. "I know exactly what men like him are capable of. That's why I'm done standing still while they do it." He turned toward the street. She caught his sleeve. Her fingers were cold through the wool. "If you stop this, he'll come after you too." He looked from her hand to her face. Gray eyes. Frightened, yes, but not weak. Only cornered. "I know. What are you going to do?" He glanced toward the forge where the unfinished ring lay on the anvil in a stripe of noon light. "Something expensive." He crossed back to his shop, took the ring in one soot-marked hand, and walked toward the church while the whole town slowly turned to watch him do it. Gideon Pike stood at the top of the church steps with Reverend Sloan at his shoulder and 2 ranch hands behind him. He was handsome only in the expensive sense. His beard was neatly trimmed. His boots shone. His smile arrived before any feeling did. "Mercer," he called. "You finally bringing me what's mine?" The crowd made a faint sound at that word. Elias climbed the steps slowly. He could smell lamp oil from inside the church, starch from pressed dresses, and the sweet edge of Gideon's hair tonic. "I'm bringing you the reason this wedding won't happen." Gideon's smile thinned. "Careful." Elias lifted the unfinished ring. "A ring is supposed to mark a promise freely made. And I don't finish work built on threats." Reverend Sloan flinched. Gideon kept his smile, but the flesh around it hardened. "Miss Whitcomb's father owed me a lawful debt. I offered a lawful arrangement. She gets a respectable home. Her aunt keeps the boarding house. Everybody wins." "A lawful arrangement?" Clara said from the churchyard gate. Every head turned. She walked forward alone, still holding the letter, her hair loosened by running and her fear burned down into something steadier. Mrs. Bell from the mercantile moved after her, carrying no weapon larger than a pie tin and somehow looking capable of war. Clara stopped where every face in Dry Creek could see her. "You threatened to tear apart my aunt's home if I refused you," she said. "That is not an arrangement. It is blackmail and a clean collar." The word fell into the day like a skillet dropped on church stone. Gideon's voice stayed smooth. "You are upset. I am clear. You are making a spectacle of private business. Private is where men like you keep women trapped." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elias turned toward Sheriff Boone, who was standing by the hitch rail doing his best to resemble Weather. "Have you seen the debt note he's using?" Boone shifted under his hat. "I've heard of it. That wasn't my question." Boone didn't like answering in public, which was one reason public questions mattered. "No," he said. "I haven't seen it." Gideon laughed, but too quickly. "Since when does a blacksmith conduct court?" "Since decent people got tired of waiting for court to arrive after the harm was already done." Elias extended his hand. "Show the note." For the first time, Gideon hesitated. That pause told the town more than any speech could have. Reverend Sloane cleared his throat. "Perhaps this would be better handled quietly." Clara said, "Quietly is how he got this far." Mrs. Bell nodded once. "Show the note." Gideon looked from face to face and found the mood less obedient than he had expected. He snapped his fingers at one of his hands. "Bring the strongbox from my office." The rider left in a spray of dust. The waiting that followed was heavier than shouting. People rearranged themselves by truth. Jonah Ames drifted toward Boone. Mrs. Bell came to stand beside Clara. Reverend Sloane retreated to the doorway and polished his spectacles as if he could wipe away the whole day. Elias stepped down from the porch and stopped a respectful pace from Clara. She kept her eyes on the church. "I was almost ready to walk back in there." He said nothing. "I told myself I could endure it. Women endure worse every day and still put supper on the table." Her fingers tightened around the letter. "I started making bargains with misery. If he leaves my aunt alone. If he lets me keep a room of my own. If he does not strike when he's angry." She took a thin breath. "There comes a point when surviving begins to look too much like surrender." Elias stared at the dust between his boots. "I know something about that." She turned to him. "Your wife." He felt the old pain move, not sharp this time, only deep. "Yes. I'm sorry. So am I." A wagon clattered somewhere at the far end of town. A dog barked twice and fell silent. Heat lay over everything like a hand. Clara said quietly, "If this goes badly, I don't want you thinking I asked you for it." "You didn't. Then why are you doing it?" He met her eyes. "Because I knew that look on your face behind the feed store. The look of somebody standing inside a life that had narrowed so far there was no air left in it." Something in her expression changed. Not relief. Recognition. The rider returned with the strongbox tied behind his saddle. The storm had arrived. "What would you have done in Clara's place, with your freedom on one side and the only home your family had on the other? Would you have kept the peace and lost yourself, or risked everything in daylight? Tell me honestly. Those are the choices that show us who we are and who the world has tried to make us." The strongbox was set on the church steps with a heavy iron thud. Gideon unlocked it himself, slow and deliberate, because men like him always believe confidence can substitute for innocence. Inside were bundles of paper, a deed ledger, a revolver, and a leather folder. He pulled out one sheet and held it up. "There," he said, "Samuel Whitcomb's note." At her father's name, Clara made the smallest sound, the kind grief makes when it's been sleeping and gets woken roughly. Gideon passed the paper to Boone first, then to Elias. The note was old. The ink in the body had browned with time. The signature at the bottom looked properly faded too. But Elias wasn't reading the words. He was reading the seal. Beside Samuel Whitcomb's signature sat an embossed witness stamp. To most eyes it looked official. To Elias it gleamed wrong. A county seal pressed into cheap paper 12 years earlier should have softened at the edges. This one held too sharp, with a bright line of silver wash catching the sun. 3 nights earlier Gideon had come to the forge asking whether a silver seal could hold detail if hardened first. Elias understood now why the man had listened so closely. Elias lifted his head. This witness seal was added later. Gideon's face did not move. Only one finger twitched. Boone frowned. "What?" Elias held up the page. "Old paper. Old ink. Maybe even a real old signature. But not an old seal. The impression is too clean." Whoever made it cast a newer stamp and silvered the edge to sharpen the lines. Gideon laughed, but the sound had iron under it. Listen to him. He shoes mules and thinks he's a banker. I shape metal for a living, Elias said. Metal leaves a history. Yours is fresh. Mrs. Bell leaned in. Jonah Ames leaned in farther. Once people get permission to examine power closely, they often become good at it. Boone squinted at the note. There is shine in it. There's sun in it, Gideon snapped. There's silver in it, Elias said. And that matters because you asked me how to harden a silver seal 3 nights ago. The murmur in the crowd changed shape. It was no longer curiosity. It was anger looking for a direction. Clara closed her eyes for one brief second, then opened them steadier than before. Gideon saw the town slipping and reached for the only tool he had left. He moved fast. One hand snatched for the note. The other drove Elias backward off the step. Elias hit hard enough to jar his teeth. The paper flew. Someone screamed. One of the ranch hands yanked his pistol. Then the whole street broke open. A shot cracked and splintered the church rail. Dust leapt. Horses reared. Boone shouted, "Mrs." Bell dragged 2 children behind the pie table with the calm efficiency of a woman who had always suspected she might one day need to command a battlefield. Gideon seized Clara by the wrist and hauled her hard against him. His revolver jammed against her ribs. "Back off," he shouted, dragging her toward his horse. "Or she dies for her father's debt." Everything stopped around that sentence. Not neatly. A child still cried inside the church. A horse still screamed at the hitch rail. But the center of the day fixed on Gideon and the woman trapped against him. Clara's face had gone white. Her eyes had not gone vacant. Elias saw fear there. Yes, but also fury. He rose slowly. Blood ran warm from his brow into his eye. "Let her go." Gideon backed toward the horse. "You think these people will save you? They've eaten from my hand for years." Nobody answered. That silence unsettled him more than shouting would have. Elias took one careful step. "You won't shoot her." Gideon smiled with half his mouth. "Try me." It was a gamble, but Elias had learned one thing about vain men. They do not like to lose their audience before the end. He took another step and said, "You always did mistake ownership for strength." Gideon shifted the gun just a fraction, enough to press harder. That was all Clara needed. She drove her elbow back into his ribs with every ounce of desperation in her body. He grunted. The gun moved an inch. Elias lunged, snatched the unfinished ring from the dirt, and threw it not at Gideon but at the horse's face. The silver band struck high on the gelding's cheek where the bridle rubbed tender. The horse jolted sideways. Gideon lost his footing. Clara tore free. The gun fired wild and blew the church window into sunlight. Elias hit Gideon at the waist and drove him into the hitch rail hard enough to shake every bridle on it. Boone came in from the left at the same instant. The 3 men went down in dust, boot leather, fists, and metal. Gideon was heavier than Elias expected, soft from rich food, but brutal. He smashed the revolver across Elias's cheek. White light burst behind Elias's eyes. Elias caught Gideon's wrist with both hands and bent it over the iron lip of the fallen strongbox. The crack was sickening. Gideon screamed and dropped the gun. Boone kicked it away and threw his weight across the man's shoulders. One ranch hand rushed forward. Jonah Ames stepped out of the crowd and swung a hitching mallet into the man's knee with the grim satisfaction of somebody settling a debt on behalf of the whole county. The fellow folded with a howl. The second ranch hand took one look at the town finally choosing sides and raised both hands. Boone slapped irons onto Gideon's good wrist. Dust drifted. The whole street stood stunned by its own courage. Then Jonah Ames put his hat back on and said into the silence, "About time." That broke whatever had still been holding people still. Voices rose from every direction. A widow whose waterline Gideon had fenced. The Talley brothers and their winter pasture. A freight bill altered after signing. A teamster forced into a false lien. Every person who had once whispered seemed to remember the use of full volume. Boone hauled Gideon upright. "You're under arrest for forgery, extortion, and whatever else the judge finds once I've opened your books." Gideon spat blood into the dust. "My books are clean, Mrs." Bell said, "So's a snake till it opens its mouth." Even Clara laughed at that, though the sound shook on the way out. By sundown, Gideon Pike sat in the freight room behind Boone's office with his arms splinted, his ledgers seized, and 2 riders on the road to Carson Ridge carrying the forged note, witness statements, and enough paper to bury him. When the noise finally drained out of Dry Creek, it left a strange quiet behind. Elias sat on the bench outside his forge with a rag pressed to his temple and his knuckles swelling dark over one hand. Evening brought the smell of coal ash, dust, and coffee drifting from the boarding house kitchen. Clara came across the street carrying a basin, clean cloths, and a bottle of liniment dangerous enough to strip paint. "You look dreadful," she said. "So I've been told." "By whom?" "My entire face." That pulled the first real smile out of her all day. She set the basin down. "Move your hand." He obeyed. The cloth she pressed to his temple was cool. He hissed despite himself. She pretended not to notice, which was kinder than sympathy. For a while the only sounds were the drip of water into the basin, the creak of the forge settling, and dishes clattering across the street. At last she said, "My aunt is asleep." Mrs. Bell gave her tea strong enough to revive the dead or flatten them. "We shall see which." "That sounds like Mrs. Bell." Clara cleaned the cut over his cheekbone with careful fingers. "I spent the last 2 hours hearing from townspeople who always suspected Mr. Pike was wicked but never imagined he would do something so monstrous. It seems wickedness becomes visible to some only when it steps into a church. People like to think evil announces itself loudly," Elias said. "Saves them the trouble of noticing it in quieter clothes." She studied him. "Why did you really do it?" The question sat between them with the cooling air. He could have said because it was right. He could have said because somebody had to. Both were true. Neither was enough. "Because I knew that look on your face," he said. The look of somebody standing inside a life that had narrowed until there was no air left in it. "I've been living in a smaller version of that since my wife drowned." Clara lowered the cloth. "You loved her very much." "Yes." "And losing her made the world look unsafe?" He watched dusk gather in the street. "No. Losing her made me think I had no business wanting anything from it again." Something in Clara's face opened then, not with pity but recognition. "My father died apologizing," she said. "Fevered, half gone, holding my hand, and saying he was sorry to leave me to men like Gideon. I was angry at him for dying, then ashamed of being angry. Today all I could hear was him thinking he'd failed me. He didn't." "How do you know?" "Because cruelty didn't make you cruel." Elias looked at her. "Fear didn't make you false." He must have done something right. That landed in her like a stone dropping through deep water. She sat beside him on the bench, close enough that her sleeve brushed his arm. "There are some losses," she said quietly, "that never grow smaller. They just stop being the only thing you can see." He turned toward her. She gave a faint, embarrassed smile. "I don't know if that's wisdom or fatigue." "It's wisdom." He looked at his hands. "Grief changes pockets. That's all." Her eyes filled. That is the kind of sentence people carry around for years. From her pocket, she drew the unfinished ring, now bent where it had struck the horse. She placed it in his palm. "I believe this belongs with you," she said. He turned the damaged silver in the fading light. "Most things can be repaired." "For the same purpose?" "No," he closed his fingers over it. "Some metal remembers too much." She watched his fist close, then melt it down. "And make what?" Her answer came softly. "Something chosen. If this story is finding you in one of those quiet evening hours when you've had to be stronger than you wanted to be, then you are exactly who it was written for. And if you want more stories where the overlooked are seen, where the cruel are answered, and where tenderness gets the last word, a like and a subscribe help keep those stories coming." He looked at her for a long moment. Lamps were being lit behind boarding house curtains. The first star had come out over the mercantile roof. "Clara," he said, "I don't want to be the next man who decides your life on the strength of one hard day." A softness passed over her face. "That may be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in years." "I mean it." "I know." They sat without speaking for a while. The basin cooled at their feet. Then Clara said, almost to herself, "Strange how the things you think are finished with you are often just taking the long road back." He didn't answer because there was nothing to improve in it. When she kissed him, it was not reckless. It was careful, like both of them understood the price of tenderness and were choosing it anyway. Her mouth was cool from the evening air. He felt her breath tremble once. Then she drew back, and whatever fear remained in the day had changed shape. Warmth had arrived. Safety had not. Gideon still had money and distant allies. The law was slow even when it meant well. But what had changed between them did not ask the town's permission. The judge from Carson Ridge arrived 11 days later with 2 deputies, a ledger clerk, and the expression of a man who had been told about a local nuisance and found instead an entire harvest of crime. Gideon's books were opened. Once they were opened, everything else followed. Forged liens, altered deeds, water rights transferred under threats, loans doubled by false entries, widow accounts drained by fees no law had ever approved. Men like Gideon relied on paper because paper made cruelty look patient. It took 3 weeks to sort the ledgers and 1 afternoon for the judge to decide Gideon Pike would stand trial in territorial court. His ranch was seized. His accounts were frozen. His office was emptied. Boone supervised every step with the grim attention of a man trying to make up in diligence what he had once lost in nerve. When Gideon was led through town in irons for transport north, he spat in the dust and shouted that Dry Creek would beg for him back before winter. No one answered at first. Then Mrs. Bell called from her storefront, "We'd sooner beg for locusts." The laughter that followed him out of town was the cleanest sound Elias had heard in years. The trial came before the first frost. Gideon was convicted on forgery, extortion, and fraud. 2 widows got their wells back. The Talley brothers reclaimed their pasture. Clara's aunt received full title to the boarding house lot. Gideon Pike was not embarrassed, inconvenienced, or mildly corrected. He was ruined. For the town, that mattered. For Clara, what mattered more was smaller. The boarding house stayed open. Better than open. It prospered. Clara took over the accounts and proved so exact with figures that suppliers tried cheating her only once each. Elias found reasons to cross the street more often than work required. Sometimes he brought hinges. Sometimes a repaired grate. Once a gate latch nobody had asked for. Clara noticed every excuse and let him keep making them. She came to the forge too, usually at dusk after supper was cleared. He taught her how to watch the colors in heated metal and trust the work without fearing the sparks. She lacked the strength for his heaviest hammer, but what she lacked in force she made up in steadiness. One rainy evening in October, she set the bent wedding ring on his anvil. "I've decided," she said. He looked from the ring to her face. "That can be dangerous. So can delay. You told me to melt it into something that belonged to me. I know what that is now." He waited. The forge popped softly behind him. Rain stitched the yard outside the open door. "A future," she said. The word hit him harder than any blow Gideon Pike had landed. He stepped toward her slowly. "Are you asking me something, Miss Whitcomb?" Her mouth curved. "I believe I am." He laughed then, sudden and young in his own ears. "I love you. I know. I love you too." He touched the bent ring with one finger. "Then this one remains only as memory. Not as a pattern," she said. "Only as proof that bad things can be melted down and made honest." So he melted the old silver with fresh added to it, enough to change the future of the metal without pretending the past had never happened. He forged 2 new bands. Plain, strong, warm in the forge light. Inside hers he engraved a line so small she had to lift it to the lamp. "Nothing chosen for you." Inside his he engraved another. "Keep walking." They were married in late spring under the cottonwoods by the creek because Clara said churches were for other people now. Reverend Sloane kept the vows brief and humble. Mrs. Bell brought pies again, this time in triumph. Jonah Ames cried openly and blamed pollen. Boone stood witness and looked solemn enough to suggest he intended to spend the rest of his life earning the badge he wore. When Elias slid the ring onto Clara's finger, his hand shook. She steadied it with her own. That was the whole shape of their life together. Years afterward, folks still told the story of the wedding that never happened and the one that did. They told it for the pleasure of seeing Gideon Pike destroyed. They told it for the relief of watching a frightened woman refuse the life arranged for her. But mostly they told it because loneliness had met loneliness in the middle of a hard town and neither had turned away. By the 3rd summer of their marriage, the boarding house yard smelled of cut grass, coffee, and forge smoke mingling in the warm dusk. Clara stood on the porch with their daughter on her hip, while Elias came up from the shop carrying a little wind chime he had made from scrap iron and silver shavings. The child reached for it, laughing in that astonished way children do when the world proves musical. Clara looked at him over her shoulder, and all the miles of grief behind them seemed at last to belong to the road rather than the house. He hung the chime from the porch beam, and when the evening breeze moved through it, the notes rang soft and clear, like a life that had been heated, hammered, and made strong enough to sing. Next time, I'll tell you about the ranch widow everyone called cursed, and the one-armed drifter who took a job repairing her fences only to discover the man buried on her hill was not the husband anyone thought he was.